A cold November wind moves through the narrow streets of Midtown Manhattan. It is 3 in the morning on November 28, 1953. Outside the Hotel Statler, a man's body lies broken on the pavement, dressed in nothing but his underwear, one slipper still clinging to his foot. Above him, a 13th floor window is shattered, glass scattered across the street like frozen rain. His name is Dr. Frank Olson, a government scientist working for the United States Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Within hours, the story will appear in morning papers. Scientist falls to death in hotel accident. The police write suicide. The CIA writes incident contained. But both are wrong. What really happened in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel was not an accident. It was an operation, and the man who fell was about to expose one of the most classified programs in American history. Frank Olson wasn't a spy or a defector. He was a bacteriologist, a scientist who spent his career studying airborne diseases, nerve agents, and psychochemical warfare. But in the decade after World War II, science and espionage had begun to blur into one thing: control. The United States had entered a new kind of conflict, a psychological arms race against the Soviet Union. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies were not just building weapons. They were building methods to master the human mind. And somewhere deep inside Fort Detrick, Maryland, in a unit known only to a handful of men, Frank Olson was helping design them. The official story said he suffered a breakdown. Colleagues said he was emotionally unstable. But when classified files surfaced decades later, the evidence told another story, one of chemical experiments on unwitting subjects, covert operations abroad, and a scientist who realized too late what he had helped create. Was Frank Olson silenced by his own government or by the weight of what he knew? The story begins in 1943, inside a walled compound at Camp Detrick, Maryland. America was still at war, and the U.S. Army's biological warfare laboratories were expanding at an alarming rate. What started as a defensive research station, developing vaccines, testing toxins, quickly evolved into something else, a secret division dedicated to offensive possibilities. Frank Olson joined the lab as a young biochemist in the Special Operations Division, or SOD. Officially, he studied how to protect soldiers from biological attack. Unofficially, he was designing the weapons that could cause them. The Cold War was approaching, and paranoia was currency. American intelligence believed the Soviets were experimenting with psychochemical control, substances that could break a prisoner's mind, extract confessions, or rewire loyalty. The U.S. needed its own version, and Fort Detrick was where that work would happen. Olson's office was small and bare, a steel desk, a locked cabinet, a window that faced a stretch of empty field. He was known to be precise, deliberate, almost clinical in everything he did. But the work was different now. Instead of anthrax cultures, he was handling lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, a new compound acquired from Swiss laboratories and soon handed over to the CIA's Technical Services staff, headed by a man named Sidney Gottlieb. The CIA called the project MKULTRA. It was officially sanctioned in April 1953 and classified higher than the atomic bomb program. Its stated mission: to develop techniques for mind control, truth extraction, and psychological manipulation. its real purpose to find out how to make men obey. Frank Olson's division, SOD, was folded into MKULTRA operations. He became part of a small circle of scientists conducting field tests, many of which were never documented. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, and sometimes foreign detainees were given unknown substances during interrogations. Olson began to question what he was seeing. He told a colleague, "We are crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed." But by then, the work had momentum. Fort Detrick wasn't just a lab anymore. It was a factory of plausible deniability. Then came the invitation. Late November 1953, Olson and several SOD scientists were told to attend a private retreat at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. The meeting, hosted by Gottlieb himself, was described as a conference on new research methods. What Olson didn't know was that he was about to become the experiment. On the second night of the retreat, as the group sat around after dinner, the men were served a round of Cointreau. The conversation drifted to theory, to secrecy, to the ethics of control. Minutes later, Olson felt his pulse spike. The room bent in on itself. He realized too late that his drink had been laced with LSD. No one had told him. By morning, he was unrecognizable to his colleagues, agitated, paranoid, muttering that he had made a terrible mistake. He asked to resign. He said he couldn't live with what he'd seen. The others reported his behavior to Gottlieb. Instead of releasing him, the agency decided to contain him. Within days, Frank Olson was taken to New York City under the pretense of psychiatric help. 9 days later, he would be dead. But before that fall, there were signs, tiny fractures in the smooth surface of secrecy, calls home that ended abruptly, a note to his wife that never reached her, a file opened at the CIA labeled Security Concern, Olson, Frank R. The first act closes here in the narrow space between science and silence. A man realizes what he has built, and the system he served begins to erase him. One signature, one meeting, one window at a time. The year is 1953. The Cold War hums beneath the polite chatter of Washington's corridors. Behind the diplomatic handshakes and press photographs, another war is underway. One fought not with bombs or bullets, but with the human mind. The Central Intelligence Agency, under Director Allen Dulles, had just launched its most secretive venture to date, Project MKULTRA. The project's stated mission was simple: to understand the mechanics of human consciousness. But inside classified briefings, the language shifts. The goal becomes control, to break, reprogram, and reconstruct the human will itself. Dr. Frank Rudolph Olson, a senior bacteriologist at the Army Special Operations Division in Fort Detrick, Maryland, was one of the scientists now drafted into this hidden front. For years, Olson's research had revolved around aerosols and biological dispersal, studies meant to defend against chemical warfare. Yet his expertise made him valuable to something darker: the psychological dimensions of warfare, how fear and suggestion could dismantle the human psyche faster than gas or gunfire ever could. By the summer of 1953, Olson was spending more time with men who didn't wear lab coats. He began attending off-record meetings in unmarked government facilities, briefings led by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Gottlieb was brilliant, eccentric, a man who believed the path to defending democracy might require shattering minds in the name of science. In one memo, Gottlieb described LSD as the key to unlocking the unconscious. He proposed that, under the right circumstances, an individual could be stripped down to their raw mental core, then rebuilt with new loyalties. Olson read the document, disturbed by its implications. By November 1953, he was invited to a private retreat in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, a rustic conference meant to review classified research under the pretense of interdepartmental cooperation. There were 9 men present, including Gottlieb and his deputy, Robert Lashbrook. The fire crackled, the bourbon flowed, and as the evening deepened, so did the experiment. Without warning or consent, Gottlieb added a few drops of LSD to the men's drinks. It was, as one later report phrased it, a test of psychological endurance under chemical influence. Olson drank his glass, unaware that his own agency had just made him a test subject. The effects arrived slowly at first, then violently. Witnesses described him as pale, withdrawn, unable to focus. He asked questions no one wanted to answer. "Why are we doing this to people?" he muttered. "Is this even science anymore?" The others laughed nervously, but in Olson's mind, the walls were collapsing. When the retreat ended, the others returned to Washington. Olson didn't. He wandered the grounds at night, trembling, speaking in fragments. One participant later admitted, "He wasn't the same man we brought here." Back at Fort Detrick, Olson's breakdown deepened. He began expressing doubts about the morality of the work, the secret tests on unwitting subjects, the ties to covert operations in Europe and Asia. He told his wife, Alice, "I've made a terrible mistake." By November 24th, CIA supervisors decided he needed psychiatric attention, but instead of sending him to a hospital, they placed him in the care of Robert Lashbrook, the same deputy present at the Deep Creek dosing. Together they traveled to New York City, checking into room 1018A at the Statler Hotel. Olson was agitated, paranoid, sleepless. He told Lashbrook he feared being locked away. He considered resigning from government service altogether. At one point he said, "I know what they're capable of. I've seen it." The morning of November 28, 1953, hotel guests awoke to a thud. Olson's body lay on the pavement below the 13th floor window. His glasses were still on his face. His wallet remained in his pocket. The CIA called it a suicide. The hotel record listed it as death by fall. No autopsy photographs were released. Within days, the agency closed ranks. Internal memoranda described the incident as an unfortunate psychological reaction to experimental materials. Gottlieb's name was scrubbed from the reports, but something didn't add up. The window glass was shattered outward, not inward. The bed sheets were undisturbed, and the night clerk later told reporters that he'd heard a second man's voice in the room just before the fall. For 2 decades, the Olson family was left with silence. The official story remained unchallenged. It wasn't until 1975, when the Church Committee began investigating CIA abuses, that fragments of the truth emerged. MKULTRA was real. The LSD experiments were real, and Frank Olson had been one of its earliest casualties. Still, even those hearings never touched the deeper question: what had Olson seen that made him a liability? Declassified memos later hinted he had witnessed post-war interrogations in Europe, where biological agents and hallucinogens were used on prisoners without consent. if he had begun to question the morality or legality of these acts, then the agency had a problem too large to contain. In 1975, President Gerald Ford personally apologized to Olson's family. The CIA called it an unfortunate accident during an experiment gone wrong. They offered a settlement of $750,000. But by then, Olson's son, Eric Olson, no longer believed in accidents. He had seen his father's exhumed skull fractured in ways inconsistent with a fall. Forensic experts concluded bluntly, this man was struck on the head before he went out that window. So, if it wasn't suicide, what was it? A silencing? A warning? Or simply the byproduct of an agency lost inside its own experiments on truth and control? The record doesn't answer. The files remain redacted. All that survives are fragments, memos, testimonies, and one final line from the autopsy file. Circumstances undetermined. Winter, 1953. Fort Detrick resumes operations as if nothing has happened. The laboratory where Frank Olson once stood is sterilized, his desk cleared, his name quietly removed from internal directories. Inside the agency, no one says the word suicide. It is replaced by a phrase, the incident. In a memo stamped confidential, Sidney Gottlieb writes, future psychological testing should occur only under more controlled conditions. There is no mention of Olson, no condolence, no acknowledgement, just a procedural note in the architecture of secrecy. The files concerning room 1018A are sealed. The surviving field reports are destroyed in 1973 by direct order of CIA Director Richard Helms, who instructs that sensitive materials related to behavioral modification be incinerated. In the silence left behind, history begins to rot. At Fort Detrick, colleagues recall fragments. One technician remembers Olson walking the halls days before his death, muttering that the people we test on are not volunteers. Another recounts that he had been summoned to Europe earlier that year to observe an interrogation site near Frankfurt, one of several black locations where suspected defectors were subjected to drugs, sensory deprivation, and isolation. Later testimony confirms these facilities existed. The codename, Project Artichoke, precursor to MKULTRA. Its purpose, breaking the human mind under chemical influence. By early 1954, the agency's internal communications changed tone. Olson is referenced not as a man, but as a precedent. His death becomes a warning to others. Keep silent, keep loyal, or vanish into paperwork. For 2 decades, his family receives no further explanation. The Army sends routine condolences. His children grow up with an official truth they never quite believe. Then, 1975. A headline breaks across American television. CIA conducted secret mind control experiments. The church committee hearings begin. Senators read from declassified fragments, contracts with universities, hospitals, and prisons, sub-projects labeled with innocuous titles, psychochemicals, hypnosis research, sleep deprivation studies. Among the exhibits, one memo referencing a civilian scientist deceased after LSD exposure. The name is redacted, but Eric Olson recognizes the dates, the address, the phrase Deep Creek Lake Retreat. For the first time, the family learns what happened that night in Maryland, that their father was drugged without consent, that his breakdown was induced, that the government had lied for 22 years. Eric Olson begins collecting fragments FOIA requests, autopsy reports, witness transcripts. Every document leads deeper into the labyrinth. In one memo from 1953, he finds a phrase that chills him. Subject expressed increasing moral opposition to research methods and may represent a security risk. He understands now his father wasn't unstable, he was disillusioned, and that made him dangerous. In 1994, Eric orders his father's body exhumed. The new forensic analysis overturns everything. The skull bears a blunt force fracture above the eye, an injury inconsistent with a simple fall. A Manhattan forensic team concludes the death was homicide of undetermined origin. The narrative collapses. The suicide becomes a murder mystery. The scientist becomes a witness, silenced. Yet the government maintains its line. No evidence of foul play, no new investigation. The Olson case remains officially closed. But the deeper story doesn't end with one man. Declassified documents reveal MKULTRA's reach. Experiments conducted at McGill University, Lexington Narcotics Hospital, Stanford, and Edgewood Arsenal. Test subjects ranged from soldiers to psychiatric patients to unsuspecting civilians. The guiding question behind every file is always the same. How much of a person can you erase before they cease to be themselves? By the late 1970s, the public learns that over 180 institutions participated, often unknowingly. The program's paper trail spans 10 years, 149 sub-projects, and countless ruined lives. In the hearings, Gottlieb testifies briefly, then retires into obscurity. Dulles dies before he can be questioned. The agency issues vague regrets. For Eric Olson, regret is not enough. He begins writing what he calls the family's alternative report. In it, he argues that his father's death was not an accident or a breakdown. It was a termination executed to protect programs that could not survive exposure. In one of his notes, Eric writes, "They called it MKULTRA. I call it the crucifixion of my father." By the early 2000s, the story resurfaces in documentaries and congressional archives. A few surviving agents, now elderly, speak off record. One remarks, "You don't understand how frightened we were of the Soviets, of ourselves. We believed any price was justified, but fear doesn't explain a man thrown from a window. Fear doesn't erase entire archives. Fear doesn't fracture a skull before the fall. The final truth remains sealed somewhere, in missing files, in the ash of Helms' incinerated memos, in whispers from laboratories that never officially existed." Summer 1976. 23 years after Frank Olson's fall, the CIA is still closing windows. Files are missing. Names are crossed out. The program's architects are retired or dead. Yet the stain remains, quiet, institutional, permanent. The official position is repetition. Dr. Olson's death was a tragic suicide following an experiment gone wrong. The agency releases statements, drafts apologies, compensates the family. But every act of contrition conceals another layer of control. The Rockefeller Commission concludes that Olson was given LSD without consent. It does not investigate homicide. It does not subpoena the men who were in the hotel room. Instead, it rewrites the ending. Olson panicked, became unstable, jumped. Case closed. Within the CIA, internal memoranda warn officers to prepare for possible public exposure of behavioral projects. In the same period, Director Helms orders the destruction of the entire MKULTRA archive, hundreds of boxes of field reports, receipts, photographs. What remains are fragments, budget ledgers, travel vouchers, marginalia. Enough to acknowledge existence, never enough to assign guilt. Behind those redactions, the program mutates. By the late 1960s, sub-projects are absorbed into other fronts. Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Search. Each inherits the same premise, that human behavior can be engineered like circuitry. The agency's accountants list them as psychochemical defense research. In one surviving note dated 1970, an analyst warns, exposure of the Olson case could compromise continuing efforts under alternate contracts. The phrase continuing efforts is deliberate. It confirms what no one was supposed to know. MKULTRA never truly ended. It simply changed its name. Meanwhile, the Olson family fights for disclosure. They meet with President Gerald Ford in the Oval Office. The mood is controlled, courteous, choreographed. Beside Ford sits CIA Director William Colby, his expression fixed, his words measured. He assures the family the agency bears deep regret. No new investigation is promised. Alice Olson accepts the apology. Eric Olson does not. In his notebook, he writes afterward, "They spoke as if my father were collateral damage, not a human being." Eric spends the next decades reconstructing the erased record. He finds declassified meeting logs placing his father at Fort Detrick sessions discussing aerosolized delivery of hallucinogens. He traces flight manifests linking agency operatives from Detrick to Frankfurt to Camp King, the same facility rumored to host covert interrogations of ex-Nazis and suspected double agents. The pattern is unmistakable. He concludes that his father had seen more than an LSD experiment. He had witnessed the export of American mind control methods to Europe, where they were tested on prisoners. If he had spoken, he could have exposed not only MKULTRA, but the moral collapse behind it. In 1994, when the homicide findings emerge, the CIA refuses comment. The Justice Department quietly advises that the statute of limitations has expired. The system closes in on itself, precisely as designed. The press revisits the case every few years. Headlines repeat the same binary, suicide or murder. But the real question lies deeper. How many institutions must collaborate to keep a single death unresolved? The deeper one digs, the more the language dissolves into euphemism. Enhanced interrogation, behavioral influence, unconventional research. Each phrase is a veil, deniable, reversible, bureaucratically pure. By the early 2000s, Sidney Gottlieb reappears briefly in an interview, aged and evasive. When asked about Olson, he says, "I can't recall the details. It was a long time ago." He dies 2 years later, taking the rest of the story with him. In 2012, the final FOIA releases confirm what had long been suspected. The MKULTRA budget exceeded $25 million, enough to sustain operations across 80 institutions. The report lists chemical interrogation, hypnotic conditioning, and biological response testing. Olson's name is nowhere, only project codes. The cover-up is complete not because it hides the facts, but because it buries them in too many truths. 1,000 pages, none of them whole. A man dead, yet officially alive in one ledger as consultant, retired. That entry appears in a 1961 personnel index. It is stamped confidential. It suggests Olson was never formally removed from the payroll. To bureaucrats, he still existed. To history, he did not. The paradox is deliberate. The ultimate erasure is paperwork that insists the erased man remains employed. By the time Eric Olson publishes his findings, The case has become emblematic of how democracies forget, how institutions preserve their myths. He titles his manuscript, The Erased Man. He writes, "They said he fell. But the truth fell first. The body was only evidence of what they'd already done. To science, to ethics, to history itself. The cover-up isn't a single lie. It's a system that keeps producing them indefinitely until disbelief becomes exhaustion." Winter 2001. A man named Frank Olson walks into the same lobby his father did nearly 50 years earlier, the Statler, now renamed the Hotel Pennsylvania. The carpets are new, the lights fluorescent white instead of tungsten gold. The elevator doors open with the same metallic echo. He rides to the 13th floor. The corridor hums faintly. At the end, room 1018A, the reconstructed version of the room his father fell from. The hotel registry confirms it. Same number, same coordinates. He stands in the doorway, silent. There's no window ledge anymore, just tempered glass, sealed for safety. He looks at it and whispers, "You never jumped." For decades, Eric has lived inside a story he didn't write. He has sifted through declassified files, coded ledgers, altered autopsy reports. He has chased ghosts through archives and interviews that end in no comment. But in this room, everything condenses: the myth, the body, the lie. He sees it as a perfect circle. A government scientist learns too much. He questions the morality of his work. He's dosed with LSD, interrogated, declared unstable. Days later, he falls from a window in a CIA-controlled hotel. What followed was half a century of managed forgetting. Eric kneels and sets a reel of magnetic tape on the carpet. The label reads, Project Seraphim. It's a copy of a recovered recording from Fort Detrick, one that supposedly never existed. He presses play. The reel crackles to life with the voice of Frank Olson, his father. The audio is distorted, aged, full of magnetic decay. But fragments pierce through. The research. It's not defense, it's control. Behavioral modification. The mind as terrain, then static. Then another voice, measured, clinical. Sidney Gottlieb. Dr. Olson's loyalty is in question. He's becoming a security risk. Recommend observation. Eric lets the reel spin until the tape flutters empty. The sound is small but final. That moment becomes the pivot of his life. He writes later, "It wasn't suicide. It wasn't even murder. It was containment. The moment he stopped believing, he became uncontainable." The file names, code words, and transcripts start aligning. He realizes Project Seraphim wasn't just a drug experiment. It was a prototype for a psychological weapon, an attempt to use hallucinogens to shatter and rebuild perception. The project collapsed after Olson's death, but the science didn't die. It was folded into new initiatives under the Department of Defense, rebranded as Behavioral Resilience Research. Eric uncovers another memo buried in a FOIA dump from 1998. It reads, Subject 01 expired during containment operation. Subsequent inquiries to be redirected through liaison channels. Subject 01, his father. The phrasing confirms what he suspected. His father wasn't a liability. They made him one. In 2017, a journalist uncovers that several surviving MKULTRA subcontractors went on to work in Silicon Valley neurotech firms. Their research papers discuss predictive behavior modeling and cognitive reinforcement loops. The language is cleaner, more modern, but the intent is identical. Control perception, shape choice. MKULTRA didn't vanish. it evolved. Eric testifies in a documentary years later. His voice carries the weight of a son who's seen too much and been believed too little. He says, "My father was the first casualty of the information age, the first man to die for knowing how far they were willing to go to rewrite reality." He doesn't cry when he says it. He doesn't need to. The gates are still guarded. The signage still reads, U.S. Army Medical Command. To anyone passing by, it's just another federal installation. But inside the archives, among the sealed boxes, one document remains filed under Seraphim. Its contents are redacted in full, all except for one sentence at the bottom. The subject demonstrated permanent dissociation between truth and perception. It doesn't specify who the subject was, and so the story of Frank Olson ends the same way it began, inside a room with questions no one wants answered.
Declassified Ages, where history reveals its secret. Like, share, and subscribe.